Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Geekery in General podcast. I am your host, Al. Today, we're going to be diving into a topic that I generally avoid unless it's something that I absolutely have to discuss. And even then, it's only if it's something that I have to put into a certain historical context, and that is the topic of politics. So if this is something that you're probably not really interested in, might want to skip this episode, that's perfectly fine. I'm also going to come off as attacking conservatives in this episode, as you could probably guess by the title. However, I want to also make it clear I am not attacking all conservatives, just specific ones. And if you're the type of conservative who tends to get offended very easily and tends to feel attacked if someone disagrees with you, even in the slightest, probably don't want to listen to this episode. Now, if you are a conservative or right-leaning person who is open to critical thinking and you're open to personal reflection and you're open to actually listening to what people from different political persuasions think about your side of the fence, you'll probably be okay. Please don't waste your time with hate mail or leaving negative comments. I won't reply to them. My personal experience when dealing with conservatives on Facebook and other similar forums is I will take my time to create a well-crafted, factual response that I can back up with evidence whenever they're trying to ask me to prove a point. And after I present this to the conservative, they usually respond with name-calling, personal attacks, whataboutisms, false equivalencies, and pretty much ignoring everything I say. And I understand this does not describe all conservatives, but that has just been my personal experience with trying to convince a conservative of anything they don't want to believe in. I might as well use that time to go in my backyard, dig a hole, and fill it back up again, because in the end, I will have accomplished about the same, which is absolutely nothing. So you might wonder why I am deciding to dive into this topic now. And I was inspired to do this topic about a week or so ago. The week recording this episode, I was talking to a very close, very dear friend of mine who I've been gaming with for a very long time. And he said that he's going to be stepping away from the gaming community for a while. Now, he didn't say if it's going to be permanent or if he's just taking a little break. I hope he does come back to gaming. I really, really enjoy gaming with this guy. Like I said, he's one of my best friends, one of my closest friends. I love him like a brother. Part of the reason that he's stepping away from our local gaming community for a while is because of politics and just how it has caused people to treat each other and just some of the online arguments and fights people get into. So that's one of the things that really made me want to think and talk about this topic. And I'm sure I'm not the only podcaster on the left who has discussed this particular topic. Politically speaking, I would be considered a moderate liberal. Last time I took that political compass test, I'm to the right of Obama, but to the left of Clinton. So again, I would always pretty much been a very moderate liberal. That doesn't mean I hate all conservatives, so I'm not trying to paint all conservatives with the same brush. One of my observations and opinion is this whole anti-wokeness crusade is destroying the gaming community. And I think it certainly is destroying a lot of other fandoms as well. I mean, look at the Star Wars franchise. As one friend of mine always liked to say, no one hates Star Wars more than a Star Wars fan. And also look at the Marvel Comics movie universe, the Marvel Cinematic Universe. You're hearing people complain about this or that or the other. Sometimes their criticisms are valid. Sometimes, I think they're just throwing a fit because they want to throw a fit. And one of the reasons I hate that term, wokeness in general, is it's a co-opted term that's been stolen from something else, and people have tried to totally redefine its meaning. Now, there is a term from gaming, both video games and tabletop role-playing games, that has suffered the same fate, and that is the term NPC, or non-player character. Now, in video games and role-playing games, an NPC is controlled by someone who's not a player. In the case of video games, it's not controlled by the person behind the joystick or the control pad. And in the case of role-playing games, a non-player character is controlled by the game master. Specifically, the way people have co-opted the term NPC tends to lean a little bit more to how they're used in video games. In a video game, an NPC is generally only programmed to say a couple of sentences of dialogue. Now, sometimes if you trigger the right event, they might change whatever they're saying. For example, if let's say you're playing a video game and you enter a village and they're being terrorized by a dragon, you might meet an NPC who says, "Please save us from the dragon." After you defeat the dragon, then their dialogue might change to say, "Thank you for slaying the dragon." So basically, an NPC is doomed to say the same thing over and over and over again until the end of time. When used in political arguments in that type of context, an NPC is usually used to refer to someone who just repeats a particular talking point over again and over again, regardless if it really fits the situation being discussed. So thus, in that context, an NPC is a person who lacks the capacity to generate their own opinions, do their own research, do their own verification, and have their own original thoughts. And I promise this is going to be relevant later on. So back to that term, woke. Now, I think the problem with this term is that it has become so overused that it's essentially become a meaningless term. Just like another similar term, SJW, or social justice warrior. And honestly, I would argue that most of the people who throw around these terms are ignorant of its origin and don't even know what it means. Don't believe me? Go to YouTube and look up videos where people are asked to define the term woke. It is not hard to find videos that show a dozen or so people giving a dozen or so different answers. Perhaps one of the most telling videos comes from an interview with Bethany Mandel, author of the book Stolen Youth. She was asked to define what the term woke means, and she couldn't provide a clear answer. This is even more outrageous when you consider she mentions she spent an entire chapter of her book defining woke, and yet, when asked to describe what it means, she struggled to give a coherent answer. She's not alone in this regards. Again, you see these person on the street interviews. You have all these people being, just giving this different answers. Sometimes you'll have people give answers that are almost kind of similar. I saw one compilation where this dude gave the room temperature IQ answer of, woke means you're an idiot. Yeah. So you would think that if this wokeness thing was this big bad monster we're all supposed to be afraid of, then there would be more agreement among conservatives as to what it means. You would think that if you went out and asked a lot of people on the political right to define that term, they'd give almost similar answers, or ones that are very close to each other. Instead, they tend to give the answers that are all over the spectrum. Let me give you some more examples of other things that I have heard as being referred to as woke. A restaurant chain known as Cracker Barrel. I remember, I think this was like last year or so, they were attacked for being woke because they added plant-based sausages to their menu. And note, I said added, not replaced. So if you go to Cracker Barrel and want to order pork sausages, guess what? You still can. The plant-based sausages are just a vegan option for their customers who are vegetarian or maybe who can't eat pork. To quote the late comedian George Carlin, it's called freedom of choice and is one of the principles this country was founded on. Look it up in the library, Reverend, if there's anything left after you're done burning all the books. Legos are also apparently woke because they introduced toy sets that had characters with disabilities. The new Mortal Kombat game is also apparently woke because the female characters are showing less skin. Can we please go back to the good old days when the biggest controversy with Mortal Kombat was Sub-Zero ripping off his opponent's head? Oh yes, also Dove soap is woke because they had an ad with overweight women. Gillette Shaving Company was also accused of being woke because they had an ad that encouraged men not to raise their sons to be bullies. Bud Light is woke because they included transgender woman Dylan Mulvaney in an advertising campaign that also included several other social media influencers as well. The Tomb Raider series has also been accused of going woke because Lara Croft now has more realistic proportions and is also showing less skin. The game Starfield is woke because guess what? You can select your character's pronouns. Remember the Titan sub disaster that killed 5 people, including the company's CEO? Well, according to some people, that was also caused by wokeness. Never mind the fact that the CEO, Stockton Rush, often dismissed safety concerns and claimed that those types of things were hampering progress. And the sub was also made with experimental materials. But again, yeah, let's blame wokeness. Did you also know that the 2023 train wreck in East Palestine, Ohio was also caused by woke culture? Because apparently recognizing the fact that racism and bigotry exists is so powerful it can cause a train to derail. And perhaps one of my favorites, M&M candy is woke because the female M&Ms don't wear high heels anymore. You heard that correctly. Right-wing propagandist Tucker Carlson is big mad because a cartoon character of an anthropomorphic piece of candy isn't sexy enough for his tastes, apparently. Yes, dear listener, because of all the problems facing the world today, let's get mad about a cartoon piece of candy and what it's wearing on its feet. Now, I'm sure there are some people out there who do know the history of the term, where it came from, and what it originally meant. But it never hurts to review for the people in the back who just don't seem to get it. Now, the term woke came from African American vernacular, where it originally was meant to remind people to be aware of racial injustices. These were things that Black Americans have had to deal with throughout the course of American history. For example, the Black Codes. These were laws that specifically were designed to limit the freedoms of African Americans. They've been around since about the time of the American Civil War, but evolved over the years. In some places, even something as simple as talking too loudly in the presence of a white woman or being disrespectful of a white employer were all it took for a Black person to be hit with a fine or jail time. Redlining is another thing that Black Americans have had to be aware of, and this was a practice which was designed to make it difficult, if not impossible, for Black people to move into white neighborhoods. There was also a book written called The Negro Motorist Green Book by Victor Hugo Green. This book came about because as more Black Americans were able to afford to buy a car, there were several things they needed to be aware of. There was once a time in American history when segregation was the norm. Many places had separate facilities for Black people. It was common for stores, restaurants, and businesses to have bathrooms and water fountains that were labeled for either white people or colored people. There was a time when Black people had to ride in the back of a bus, and when Black people couldn't go to certain schools. And a business could even refuse service to someone for no other reason than the color of their skin. Thus, a Black motorist would need to be aware that necessities such as food and lodging would not be available to him everywhere he went. The last thing an African American would want would to have their car run out of gas in a small town where there were no gas stations that would be willing to serve Black people. More importantly, they also needed to take note of places known as sundown towns. These were towns where if you were Black, and in some cases not just Black, if you were Jewish or if you were any non-white race, you had better be out of town by the time the sun sets, and that was a local law that was passed. So if you were caught within the city limits after sundown, if you're lucky, maybe you might just be harassed and intimidated until you left town. Most likely, you would be taken by the cops and thrown in jail. If you were unlucky, you might be murdered. So this is where it gets frustrating when I hear people overuse that term woke and just throw it around haphazardly. The word meant from meaning to be aware of social injustice to shorthand for something I don't like. In my opinion, when used in the context of a political argument or speech, the speaker is essentially saying, I have no real points to make, so I'm going to call something woke instead because I know it will get an emotional reaction. Another problem with this anti-woke crowd is described in a video called Woke Spotting by YouTube channel Pillar of Garbage. Basically, all you have to do is say something is woke, yell into a webcam while discussing it without proper context, and your video might get hundreds of thousands of views. And this video did make several good points. One of them that I do remember is the person narrating the video was saying that if movies like Alien or The Terminator came out today, there would be people who would probably call them woke because both of these movies feature a female character as the lead. And as the person who created this video also mentioned, if everything is woke, then nothing is woke. So I thought that was an interesting take on the matter. Compare it to the character Syndrome in The Incredibles, how he wanted to make technology available to give everyone superpowers. I don't remember the exact phrasing, but I think he said, because when everyone is super, no one will be. Now, I've also seen people come up with lists of woke RPG companies. This effort focuses on trying to tell people not to buy from certain game companies because they perceive them as being too woke. I wouldn't advise trying to look for these sites, though, unless you have a high tolerance for bigotry. According to one of these forums, a criteria for determining if a game is woke is if it uses Black people where they are not needed. Only the person who posted that didn't say Black people. They used a different word that begins with the letter N, and it wasn't Negro. I've often asked myself, how did we get to this point? How were hobbies like role-playing games and video games, things that were once associated with white male nerds, get dragged into this culture war nonsense? My opinion, the problem is the rage baiters, the people who get on their soapbox, be it a podcast, a YouTube channel, a blog, or forum, and scream like an unhinged lunatic. You know the type. They call everything they don't like woke, and everyone with an opinion they don't agree with an SJW. They use the same talking points we hear from other rage baiters over and over again. They tell people what they want to hear regardless of whether or not it's accurate, and parrot their opinions back at them. Remember I talked about the term NPC at the start of this episode? Ironically, rage baiters love using this label on people they don't agree with, yet they seem to fail to realize they are doing the exact same thing. If John the rage baiter attacks a movie or game or a comic book for being woke because the lead character is not a white heterosexual male, then you can bet that all the other rage baiters will follow suit using the same reasons. I think one of the biggest problems with these people is that they rarely take anything within its proper context. They offer no solutions or alternatives other than don't watch that show or don't play that game because it's woke. So here's my advice to these type of content creators, since I'm sure they are all listening to my show. Look, you might not like a decision you see and label it as woke, but instead of focusing on the fact that a game has a non-white, non-heterosexual, non-male character as the lead, instead ask if that decision really harmed the game. Look at the game Starfield I mentioned earlier. Now, I have not played the game myself, mainly because I'm really not into that particular genre of video game. If it wasn't for the fact that people were angry over the fact that you can choose your character's pronouns, I probably wouldn't have looked into it. But you would think with all the negative attention the game got, that Starfield was on par with games like Shaq Fu or E.T. for the Atari 2600. But at least as far as I've seen, the reviews for the game are generally positive. Aside from bugs, which you will find in just about every game nowadays, seems like a pretty good game. But of course, the rage baiters decide to focus on what will get them attention. And in Starfield's case, what gets them attention is getting triggered over pronouns. Another issue is that this type of content is quick and easy to make, allowing rage baiters to get several videos out in the time it would take for someone else to produce a single, well thought out, exhaustively researched, carefully constructed reply backed up by facts and evidence. As I mentioned at the start of this episode, that's pretty much been my experience when trying to get in any sort of political discussion with conservatives on Facebook or similar forums. I will spend 15-20 minutes making a reply, and then when the person sees it, they pretty much ignore everything I said. They don't address the points. If I disprove something they said and provide evidence, they ignore that, and they call me a libretard, or they call me whatever other name, and resort to the usual whataboutisms and false equivalencies. So to get back on track, by the time Joe Fact Checker debunks the rumor that the mantle of Captain America is going to be taken up by an overweight, disabled, multiracial, transgender lesbian with autism, John Rage Baiter has created 6 more videos about 6 different topics. In the case of YouTube, the almighty algorithm sees that John Rage Baiter is getting more videos out and getting more views, so his content is more likely to be pushed than Joe Fact Checker's reply. This makes it harder to counter rage bait content because it's so much easier to get that type of content out there. And since more views equals more money, and some of these rage baiters make thousands of dollars a month, I don't think they're likely to stop this practice out of the goodness of their hearts. This content is lazy. I have seen videos of this nature where all the person does is read an article or watch a video and make occasional comments. There is no research, no contemplation, no insight, and no thought put into it on the count of the person making the video. At best, this type of short-form content is a wild rant devoid of any critical thought or intellectual value. At worst, it can be misleading, deceitful, and can lead others to being harassed for no other reason than someone dared to have a different opinion. So what do we do to fix this? Now, I can't really speak to the video game and comic book communities because that's not a space I'm really involved in. But I would like to address my fellow fans of tabletop role-playing games. I'm a white male in my late 40s. I was introduced to Dungeons & Dragons in the early 80s and started playing regularly by the late 80s. I have played most versions of Dungeons & Dragons, with the exception of the white box set. And I am a diehard fan of 2nd edition, but will play any version of the game. Now, I haven't been around since the dawn of role-playing games, but I've been rolling dice for a while. One of the trends I've noticed is the tendency for gamers of my age or older to discuss anything that deviates too far from earlier versions of D&D as being woke. The opinion is that anything past, insert my favorite edition of the game here, is garbage. Look, and that's fine. There is no rule that says you have to like all versions of Dungeons & Dragons in order to call yourself a fan of the game. If you don't like 1st edition or you don't like 3rd edition or you're not crazy about 5th edition, that's perfectly fine. We all have our own tastes when it comes to games. But I think a line is crossed when we start using our nostalgia for the past as an excuse to make attacks against other people over a difference of opinion or for the purpose of picking unnecessary fights. Us older gamers aren't going to be around forever. If we want the role-playing game hobby to thrive, we need to bring in new players. We're not going to do this by making the hobby uninviting to newcomers. Let me give you an example. Back when my son was in elementary school, a friend of his introduced him to radio-controlled cars. He wanted to try it out, and we went to a local hobby store that had a room with a racetrack. Since he wasn't sure if this was a hobby he wanted to get involved with, we rented an RC car from the store. Now, the people at the store and the other customers we interacted with were nice, and they answered any questions we had. No one said to us, "What? You didn't build your own car from scratch? You had to rent it from the store? Get out of here, you stinking noob." If that would have happened, what opinion do you think I would have had of the local RC racing crowd? Not a very positive one, you can be sure. Now, we might not agree with all the decisions that Wizards of the Coast has made since taking over the D&D brand, but that doesn't mean they hate all of us old schoolers. We can't forget that all of these RPG companies are businesses, and they need to make decisions that will make money. Those decisions have to include attracting new customers. When I was talking to my friend, one of the points he brought up is that people in our age group aren't necessarily the target demographic for D&D anymore. They need to bring younger people into the hobby. One thing that I think some people in my age group or older tend to forget is that times change, as does what is considered socially acceptable. Look at the D&D movie Honor Among Thieves. We learned that Edgin, one of the main characters, is a white guy who was married to a black woman. While today, an interracial marriage is hardly shocking in most parts of the U.S., there was a time when this was not only met with disapproval, but was also illegal. In fact, interracial marriage was not fully legalized in the United States until 1967. And as a side note, I didn't bring this up to bash Honor Among Thieves. I actually liked the movie and thought it was fairly true to the game. It was certainly better than the first Dungeons & Dragons movie. Now granted, I thought that the Tiefling Druid was a little too overpowered, but I loved the cameo depicting the characters from the D&D cartoon of the early 80s. Yes, I did watch it as a kid, and my favorite character was Hank the Ranger. My point here is that the younger generation, in general, has become more accepting of things like the LGBT plus community, people of different races, and social issues that don't directly impact them. It makes sense that RPG companies are aware of these changes and attitudes and adopt to them. I'm not saying that all role-playing games out there take this more inclusive approach. If you want a game that focuses on edgier themes and tries to emulate the feel and style of older role-playing games, I assure you, they are out there. As a community, bridging these gaps needs to be a cooperative effort. We older gamers need to set the example. We need to realize that the world will never go back to the good old days, however we choose to define them. Times change, and not all changes are for the worst. Remember this verse from the Billy Joel song, Keeping the Faith. The good old days weren't always good, and tomorrow ain't as bad as it seems. As for the younger gamers, please realize that not all of us older gamers are your baby boomer grandparents. In any case, both sides need to learn to not allow themselves to be manipulated by people whose paycheck depends on stirring up conflict and playing on people's hate, ignorance, insecurity, and fear. Now, please understand that I did not record this episode to say that everyone who thumps their chest and proudly claims that they're anti-woke is a bad person. I'm also not saying that everyone who loves to proclaim how woke they are is a saint. It's just that role-playing games are very near and dear to me. Some of the happiest moments of my life have involved sitting around a table with friends, a pizza, character sheets, and dice. I don't like seeing a hobby I love and a community I have been a part of for so many years ripped apart by bad actors who profit off of spreading fear and disinformation. You have been listening to a presentation of Point of Insanity Game Studio. Visit us on the web at poigamestudio.com. Follow us on Twitter at poigamestudio. Look us up on Facebook and email us at poigamestudio@gmail.com.